Today we have some more actual history about the Republic of Texas and their battles against several Indian tribes in the late 1830s. The Texians also had to defend against Mexican insurgents, who were attempting to form an alliance with various tribes of Indians, while the settlers routinely had to defend their homes against Comanche raids, particularly on the western frontier. In the 1830s, they also faced depredations in East and North Texas by allied Indians who included Cherokees, Kickapoos, Delawares, Shawnees, and Seminoles. Some of these Indians had settled near the Red River or near the Sabine, after having been pushed further west by previous settlements. We will be reading from this book, Indian Depredations in Texas, by J.W. Wilbarger. This book was published all the way back in 1889. We are first going to hear a general account of the war between the Texas Republic and the Cherokees and their allied bands. We will then hear about the massacre of the Edens-Madden families in Houston County, Texas, on October 18, 1838. Several of the young men had joined the militia, serving under Captain William Sadler, one of their neighbors, and as a result there were only old men and women and children at the homes in which the attack occurred. So here's the story of the war between the Cherokees and the Republic of Texas that occurred just a couple years after the Texas Revolution. The Texan government were fully posted as to the intended movements of the various tribes of Indians, who at that time inhabited eastern Texas. Conspicuous among them was Bowles, chief of the Cherokees, and who was looked upon by his associated tribes as a kind of leader or headman among them all. The Cherokees and their associated tribes, the Delawares, Kickapoos, Seminoles, Shawnees, and others, numbering some 12 tribes, had settled in eastern Texas as early as 1822, and had established a village north of Nacogdoches, the town at that time being a waste, lately swept by the forces of Long and Perez. These Indians owned a considerable number of stock, had cultivated the lands to some extent, and had made some progress in the direction of civilization. As late as 1835, there were no settlers in northern Texas, except a few on Red River. While the Revolution was going on from September 1835 to April 1836, great uneasiness was felt among the whites lest Cordova and other Mexican emissaries, who were known to be among the Indians, should persuade them to take an active part against Texas in her war with Mexico. To avert such a threatening danger, General Sam Houston sent Commissioners John Forbes and Dr. Cameron among the Indians to negotiate a treaty with them, and if possible to get them to assume a neutral position. Their mission was only partially successful, however, and the whites were still distrustful. During all this time, General Houston's little army had all they could do to attend to Santa Anna, who was marching upon Texas with vastly superior forces, laying waste to the country on his entire line of march. The settlers fleeing from the invading army of Santa Anna were moving along the frontier, scattered all along the Trinity River to the Sabine. It was at this critical juncture that Major General Edmund P. Gaines, USA, crossed the Sabine at the head of 500 men, and established headquarters in Nacogdoches. He immediately sent messengers to the Indians, with instructions to say to them that if any of the Texan women and children were killed by them, he would at once attack them with his whole force. This bold move of the patriot and soldier, General Gaines, had its desired effect, and restrained the Indians, if they had any intention of depredating at that time. The memory of this gallant soldier and true patriot should be held dear by all Texans for the generous and timely aid he rendered them in this hour of need. The Battle of San Jacinto was fought soon after this, which gave the Texans great prestige, and the defeat of Santa Anna saved the people of eastern Texas from immediate danger from the Indians, though the feeling of enmity still existed between them and the whites. It was not long before the families of Pierce and Kilo were murdered, only 3 or 4 of the latter escaping, and these were brought into the settlements by the Cherokees, who cunningly represented to the Secretary of War that these murders had been committed by the Prairie Indians and treacherous Mexicans. To prevent such occurrences, Major Walters had been ordered with 2 companies to occupy the Neches Saline, not only to watch the Cherokees, but to cut off their intercourse with the Indians of the prairies. Bowles, the Cherokee chief, notified Major Walters that he would repel by force such occupation of the Saline, As the major's force was too small to carry out his orders, he established his post on the west bank of the Neches, out of the Cherokee territory. General Houston, while President of the Republic, did all in his power to allay the growing excitements and preserve peace. Having spent his early boyhood in the mountains of Tennessee, in close proximity to the Cherokees, and previous to his coming to Texas having lived among them for 4 years, he was familiar with their character and customs, and in addition to this, being very popular with this tribe, he necessarily exercised great influence over them. This being generally known caused many to suspect that General Houston had delayed in taking decisive steps against the Cherokees, because he was more favorably inclined to them than to his own people. Indeed, says an old Texan, so strongly was the opinion entertained at the time by many of the Texans that nothing but General Houston's great personal popularity could have sustained him in the almost neutral position he occupied in regards to the troubles then existing between his quondam friends, the Cherokees, and their white neighbors. However this may be, it is evident that he naturally felt kindly towards them, and was anxious to preserve peace between them and the Texans. Moreover, Houston was aware that it frequently happened that lawless whites upon the border, in some instances, were to blame for the outrages committed by the Indians in a spirit of retaliation, and no doubt he adopted a conciliatory policy, and delayed taking any decisive action until he could definitely ascertain first who were the guilty parties, and to what extent the Indians were to blame, and he would then be in a condition to deal fairly with both parties. However, General Houston's forbearance toward the Indians seems to have been exhausted, and in the latter part of his administration, General Rusk, Commander-in-Chief of the militia forces of the Republic, was ordered out. It seems that on the 4th of August, 1838, a party of citizens were in pursuit of some stolen horses, and after going some distance found them secreted in a Mexican settlement, and on their return they were fired upon and one of their number killed. Several persons set out on their trail in pursuit of the murderers, but after traveling some distance, they became convinced from the size of the trail that there were a considerable number of Mexicans, and they returned home. About the 7th of August, it was ascertained that about 100 or more Mexicans were encamped about the Angelina, under the command of Nathaniel Morris, Cordova, and Cruz. General Rusk made an immediate requisition for men. On the evening of the 10th, it was reported that the Mexicans had been joined by about 300 Indians, and that the enemy, consisting of Mexicans and Indians, now amounted to about 600 men. On the same day, General Houston, who was then at Nacogdoches, received a letter from the Mexican leaders, headed by Vincent Cordova, disclaiming allegiance to Texas, and then set out on their march for the Cherokee Nation. Houston, having been posted as to their movements, directed General Rusk not to cross the Angelina. Major Augustine, with 150 men, was detached to follow the Mexican trail, while the main body of the Texans under General Rusk made for the headquarters of Bowles, where he suspected the enemy had gone. On reaching the Saline, however, he discovered that the insurgent leaders had fled to the Upper Trinity, and that their followers had disappeared. Thus ended this little expedition. But during the month of October of the same year, General Rusk was found marching at the head of about 200 men on his way to Fort Houston on the Trinity, in pursuit of a motley crowd of Mexicans and Indians who had been committing depredations on the frontier. Learning that the enemy were at the Kickapoo town, he marched to that place and encamped there on the 15th. At daybreak on the morning of the 16th, he attacked the enemy, and after the engagement had lasted about 15 minutes, Rusk ordered a charge. The enemy were completely routed, and were pursued about a mile, leaving 11 of their dead upon the field. This closed the engagements with the Indians in eastern Texas for the year 1838, and after having thus discussed the policy of General Houston towards the Cherokees and their allies, we now return to the beginning of the Cherokee War proper. General Mirabeau B. Lamar, having been inaugurated President of the Republic on the 9th of December 1838, and being in full sympathy with the whites, it was apparent that his policy toward the Indians would be an aggressive one. After his inauguration, he attempted a reconciliation of the existing troubles, but failing to effect a peaceable removal of the Indians, or to get any satisfactory assurances from them that they would cease depredating upon the whites in the future, he determined to drive them from the country. Nor did he lose any time in making the necessary preparations. Major Walters having been stationed on the west bank of the Neches, as previously noted. Colonel Burleson, who at that time was collecting a force on the Colorado River to operate against other Indians, was directed to march his force in close proximity to the Cherokee territory, so that he might be prepared to enter the same on short notice. Burleson reached the Neches on the 14th of July with about 400 men. He was accompanied on this expedition by Vice President David G. Burnett, General Albert Sidney Johnston, Secretary of War, and others holding high official positions. Colonel Landrum, with a regiment from eastern Texas, arrived at about the same time. General Rusk, with a regiment from Nacogdoches, had arrived a few days previous. The entire force was placed under the command of General K. H. Douglas. In the afternoon of the 15th of July, the combined forces of Burleson, Rusk, and Landrum, under the command of General Douglas, attacked the Cherokees and their allied bands, who had taken up a strong position about 7 miles up the river, above the council grounds, and were awaiting the attack. The Texans coming up in the open prairie were fired on by the Indians who occupied a hill near a ravine, and then retreated in the ravine. The engagement then became general. The ground was stubbornly contested by the Indians, and from a little before sunset when the fight began, until dark, the conflict was sharp and fierce. Finally, however, the Texans made a determined charge upon the Indians, and the latter fled, leaving behind them on the field 18 of their warriors dead. The Texans only had 3 killed and 5 wounded. During the night the Indians retreated several miles, and when the Texans came upon them in the afternoon of the 16th, they found the enemy strongly posted in a wooded ravine, about half a mile from the Neches, ready for battle. The Texans were compelled to advance through an open country, and consequently were greatly exposed to the fire of the enemy, but they continued to advance, pouring hot shot into the Indians. The Indians, after standing their ground for a while, finally fled into the Neches bottom, and sought protection in the swamps and thickets, not attempting to make another stand. This was a hotly contested battle, and during the engagement, which lasted about an hour and a half, the Indians had about 100 of their warriors killed and wounded, and among the former was their distinguished chief Bowles. The Texans lost 5 killed and 27 wounded. Among the latter were Vice President Burnett, General Albert Sidney Johnston, Adjutant General McLeod, and Major Kaufman. The Indians were completely routed in this engagement, and notwithstanding that they had an estimated force of about 800 against 500 Texans, they were taught by this engagement the superior generalship of the whites over the Indians. Their trail was followed for several days by the Texans, who passed many of the Indian villages and cornfields, all of which were destroyed by the Texans. On the evening of the 25th the pursuit was abandoned, whereupon the troops were all marched home, and mustered out of service. This was the last fight between the whites and the Cherokees in eastern Texas, but notwithstanding the crushing defeat they had sustained, they continued for several months depredating upon the lives and property of the frontier people. After the death of Bowles, his son John and an Indian named Egg became the head chiefs of the allied tribes, who now took refuge on the headwaters of the Trinity River, where they remained for a few months. In the fall of 1839, John Bowles and Egg attempted to lead their followers into Mexico, passing entirely above the settlements. But Colonel Burleson, who happened to be out on a campaign against the wild tribes, came across their trail, followed it, and attacked them on Cherokee Creek, near the mouth of the San Saba River, some 75 miles above Austin. This was on Christmas Day, 1839. John Bowles and Egg were both killed in the engagements, and several of the warriors and 27 women and children captured, among whom was the wife of Chief Bowles, who had been killed in eastern Texas. All their camp equipage was also captured. The Indians fought desperately for a short time in this engagement, but they could not stand very long the hot fire that was being poured into them by the Texans. Those of the Indians who escaped from this fight retraced their steps and joined their kindred in the Indian Territory. This was the last fight with the Cherokees in Texas. We believe that it was in this engagement that the gallant Captain John L. Lynch was killed whilst leading a charge against the enemy. The Indian prisoners were all delivered by Colonel Burleson to the agents of the government. So that was an overview of the war between the Cherokees and the Republic of Texas. Sam Houston tried to postpone a confrontation, as he had lived with the Cherokees for several years. But when Mirabeau B. Lamar was elected president in 1838, he took a much more aggressive approach. This story also mentions the massacre of the Kilo family, which occurred on October 5, 1838. They lived in present-day Anderson County, near a Kickapoo camp. And when many of the men were out in the fields, they were attacked by Indians, and 18 men, women, and children were killed. This act was blamed on the Cherokees, but it may have been Vicente Cordova's group of allied Mexicans and Indians. This led to the men from Houston County being mobilized under General Rusk to attack the Kickapoo village. So here's the story of an attack made on the Madden and Edens families, while several of the men were away with the militia. The Madden family came to Texas in the year 1832 and settled in Houston County. In order to secure themselves against the attack of Indians, Madden and 2 or 3 of his neighbors, as was frequently the custom in those days, jointly built some strong log cabins close together, in which they might take refuge in case of necessity. In the fall of 1838, in the light of the moon, the time usually chosen by the Indians for making raids into the settlements, the families of Mr. Madden and others had collected at these log buildings for common defense. The house in which they were was a double log cabin consisting of 2 rooms with an entry between them. The men, 3 or 4 in number, were in one room, and the women and children in the other. The men were engaged in molding bullets and making preparations for defense. All the firearms were in the room occupied by the women and children. A while after dark, they were suddenly startled by the shrill yells of a large party of Indians. The Indians had crept up cautiously and had found out that the inmates of the house were divided in the manner above mentioned. Some of the Indians rushed to the room in which the women and children were, while others stood guard at the door of the room occupied by the men. The former, with tomahawks and butcher knives in hand, easily effected an entrance, while one of their number guarded the door by placing one hand on each side of the door frame above, and one foot on each side below, thus preventing the inmates from escaping whilst the work of death was being carried on. The Indians who had entered the room immediately attacked Mrs. Madden, wounding her severely in the face and other parts of her body. Finally, from the effects of repeated wounds, she fell, and in falling she happened to roll under the bed nearby. One of her little sons, seeing her lying under the bed, crawled to her for protection. One of the Indians struck another lady a terrible blow on the head with his tomahawk, fracturing the skull and knocking her into the fireplace. The blood flowed so profusely from the wound as to extinguish the flames, and the Indians were compelled to carry on their work of destruction in the dark. At this junction, Mrs. Madden, who had previously noticed the position of the Indian guarding the door, strange as it may seem, actually crawled out of the room between his feet, followed by her little son, without being seen by him, as his attention was drawn to what was going on in front. As it was then dark, she crept to a slave cabin some distance from the house, unobserved by the Indians outside, where she hid herself under some old clothes. 7 women and children were slain in this dreadful affair. When the Indians had finished their diabolical work, they set fire to the house, which was consumed with the bodies of their victims. Strange to relate, the men in the other room remained there for some time, listening to the dying groans of their wives and children, and because they were unarmed, did not attempt to go to their relief. They watched for an opportunity and fled, leaving the poor women and children to their sad fate. The only instance probably of such shameful cowardice recorded in the bloody annals of Texas. It does seem strange that these men, although unarmed, could have resisted the dying appeals of their wives and children. They might have rushed forward together with sticks or clubs, pocket knives, anything, and made an effort to rescue their helpless families. It would have been far better and much more honorable than to have acted as they did. Mr. Madden, when he left the house, was discovered and pursued by 2 Indians. He had the same little boy with him who had crept out of the room with his mother between the Indians' feet at the door. This somewhat retarded his movements, but as he passed through the cornfield, he pulled up a stalk and presented it at the Indians who were pursuing him. In the dark, they supposed it was a gun and stopped. Taking advantage of this, he and his little son hurried on, and finally entered a dense canebrake, where they concealed themselves. Mrs. Madden came very near bleeding to death, but after a protracted illness, she eventually recovered from the wounds she had received. It appears the Indians were so close to the house before they attacked it that they had learned the minutest particulars in regard to the situation of the inmates. This is evident from the fact that one of the men who had been in the room occupied by the women and children remarked as he started to leave that he must have more bullets. He had been but a little while in the men's room when the attack was made, and one of the Indians exclaimed in broken English, "More bullets, ha!" plainly showing he had been near enough to overhear the remark. The Indians took all the firearms in the house, and when they had gone perhaps a quarter of a mile they threw their own guns away, and retained those they had found at the station. They then made their way back to their mountain retreats, without being pursued. So that is the end of the account of the massacre on the Madden and Edens families, from J.W. Wilbarger's 1889 book, Indian Depredations in Texas. This occurred in October of 1838, and it would be the following July when these Indians would be routed from this area by the combined force under General Douglas. This force included Vice President David G. Burnett and several other high-ranking officials within the government of the Republic of Texas. These men fought in this military campaign while in office, and Burnett was injured in the battle on the Neches. I am now going to read this section from a blog about the ancestry of the Edens family from Houston County, Texas. Many of the people killed in this massacre were members of the Edens family. I will also post a link to this blog in the description for this video. It tells a lot more about the events surrounding the Cherokee War. So here is the Edens family account of what happened on October 18th, 1838. Several older men of the San Pedro Creek area, and a number of wives and children of the men in Captain Sadler's company, had gathered in the home of John Edens, probably shortly after Sadler's volunteers had been ordered to Fort Houston on October 11th. It is possible that those who gathered at the Edens home continued a fairly normal routine during the day, but retired to the Edens home for protection at night. Gathered there on the night of October 18, 1838, were John Edens, his son-in-law James Madden, Elias Moore, and Martin Murchison, the father of John Murchison, who had been wounded 2 days earlier at Kickapoo village. Among the women and children who were present were John Edens' second wife and daughters, Emily 16, Caledonia 3, and Melissa 1. Also present were Edens' daughter Lucinda Madden, wife of James Madden, and their sons, Bayless 9, Robert 7, and Selden 4. Others present were Mrs. Robert Nancy Halhauser Madden, and her daughter Mary, age 3, and Mrs. John Murchison and her stepdaughter-in-law, Mrs. William T. Sadler. It is known that the Indians attacked at bedtime, and were able to isolate the 4 men in one of the cabins of the double-cabin home. The women and children in the other cabin were at the mercy of the Indians. Killed were John Edens' wife, his daughters Emily and Caledonia, and grandsons Robert and Selden Madden. Also killed were Mary Madden, Mrs. John Murchison, and Mrs. William T. Sadler. Severely wounded were Lucinda Madden and Mrs. Robert Madden, but both recovered to lead long and productive lives. Infant Melissa Madden was carried to safety by Patsy, a slave who had probably been her nursemaid. Patsy was credited with also saving the 2 severely wounded women, Lucinda Madden and Miss Robert Madden. 9-year-old Bayless Madden was able to escape, as did the 4 men isolated in the other cabin. With coals from the fireplace in the women's room, the Indians were able to set fire to the structure which totally consumed the home, and many of the bodies of the dead. So that's it for this episode. It appears that one of the dead was the wife of Captain Sadler, who had organized a company of fighting men from around this area. So when he came home, he found that his wife had been killed by the Indians. Let us know what you think about this episode in the comments, including about the actions of the men in the other cabin. And stay tuned to this channel for more actual history about people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has now been deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, our mission is to present this truly worthy history of our ancestors by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our mission on this channel, then you can become a Patreon or YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.